Hello, everyone, and welcome to our training today. Today, we're diving into shelf corporations. Everything you need to know if you're even thinking about setting up a shelf corporation for your business to get business credit and financing, as many people do. By the end of this training, you're going to know a lot about shelf corporations, what they are, how they work, and most importantly, you're going to hear from a lot of experts from FTC and government agencies all the way to the bureaus on what happens if you're using a shelf corporation. And I'll give you a little hint. It can absolutely shut down your entire commercial credit profile once the reporting agencies figure this out. So let's dive in and talk a little bit more. For those who don't know me, my name is Ty Crandall. I'm CEO of Credit Suite. And at Credit Suite, this is what we do. Help business owners build business credit for your EIN that's not linked to your personal social. So if you'd like to get credit without a personal guarantee, without a personal credit check, give us a ring, 877-600-2487, or you'll see our link on the bottom of our slides, creditsuite.com/EIN, to grab our free guide that maps out the exact steps to success. So look, no shortcuts in life. Same applies for business. And one of the most common type of shortcuts where business owners try to get more capital is by setting up what's known as an actual shelf corporation. Now, what is a shelf corp? Well, a shelf corporation is basically a corporation on paper only. So it was basically formed, it was created, and then it was basically put on a shelf for the entire purpose of just aging the corporation. So for an example, for $70 in Florida, I can go set up a new entity. Let's call it abcentity.com. So I can go set up abcentity.com for $70. So there's a whole business out there of people that go do that, and then they just don't do anything with that company. They just let the company sit there. They let it age because the entity was set up months ago, now years ago, okay? And they pay the annual reports, and that's all that happens with the entity. So the term shelf or aged only means the company was already filed, and it's just basically sitting on a shelf. That's why they call it a shelf corporation. Now, it's important to note, a shell corporation, S-H-E-L-L, is definitely different than a shelf, S-H-E-L-F corporation. So a shell and shelf corporation are two completely different things. But a shelf corporation is what we're talking about today, and they call it a shelf corp for this reason. It was basically formed for the entire purpose of just sitting on a shelf and actually gaining age, and then basically being able to sold down the road for an increased amount because inherently it has some kind of value. And we'll talk about that today. And John says, good afternoon, Ty. Thanks for the great info. Thanks, John. I appreciate that from YouTube. And Chili from Facebook says, hello. Thanks for coming in. So shelf corporations also go by other names: aged corporations, off-the-shelf corporations, seasoned shelf corporations, aged trade lines, credit-ready corporations. So they go by a lot of different names of people that try to sell them and kind of want to corner that aspect of the industry. So they have their own fancy name for it. But all of these are the exact same thing. They all are indicators of a shelf corporation. So shelf corporations are not the same, as I mentioned, as a shell corp. Okay, shell corporations are completely different entities, both in scope and formation. And shell corporations often have no significant assets or operational structure. So the biggest difference is shell corporations are kind of used for a lot of different reasons, right? Some reasons that people use a shell corporation as a holding company to put their other assets under, for example. So shell corporation could just be there to own the other entity assets. And it's just basically a way of diversifying risk, right? So we put assets of our business in different entities to protect them differently. And again, if you're talking to trusted estates attorneys or attorneys that focus in that area, that's why a lot of shelf corporations exist. Shelf corporations are typically, or the main purpose of shelf corporations is just their age. Okay, the value of them is that they've been open a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, whereas shell corporations, they're not intended to age. They're intended to house typically other entities for different reasons, which really have to do with risk diversification ultimately. So shelf corporations are made for only one purpose, as I mentioned, to be sold in the future for the value of the age. And again, shell corporations are really meant to house kind of other entities. But shelf corporations, only real purpose they have is just simply the age that the business has been open for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. So a person forms this company and does nothing with it other than file the annual reports. And then once the corporation's a few years old, then it has some kind of value apparently for the right person. And then those companies will then try to sell those entities. Now, it used to be that it was considered a legitimate way to streamline a startup. Okay, they were rather useful back in the day before electronic registrations for entities. However, selling them now is a means of kind of getting around credit guidelines. That's something that's fairly new. So shelf corporations existed for a long time. And honestly, they had a pretty good purpose in the past. It made sense. Before we could go online to register a new entity, you had to do it by mail. And when you had to go to the Secretary of State by mail to set up a new business, that took weeks or in some states months to set up. So people that needed their business to be off the ground right now had two choices. They didn't have two choices. They only had one. A shelf corporation was the best solution for them because otherwise they had to wait weeks or months for that entity to actually be able to be formed because it all had to be done by mail. But since electronic registrations take place, since we can now go online to sunbiz.org in Florida and set up an entity online in 10 minutes and get our corporation papers, well, then they really don't have a use for what they used to have be used for. So now the owners of these, the seller of these, have kind of branched out in the last 5-10 years, and now they start selling them as a way to basically get credit faster, right? The idea here is that, hey, if you have a corporation and it's open longer, well, then your ability to get money is greater. That's their new sales pitch, because the old sales pitch doesn't work anymore. It's no longer a faster way to set up an entity when you can set up a new entity online in 10, 15 minutes. So are there any ways the shelf corporation can actually be legit now? Well, shelf corporations are legal. I mean, there's nothing that makes them illegal. Anybody can go set up an entity and do nothing with it and have it sit on the shelf. I've done that before with entities, not to sell them, but just because I wanted to form entities and grab the name, and I didn't do anything with those entities. So it's completely legal to set up a corporation. It's completely legal to set up a corporation for the intent of selling it. Those are all completely legal. In theory, they could be used by someone who may not otherwise qualify for a loan or line of credit. That's what the idea is that you can get a government contract, you can get a loan, you can get business credit, you can get a line of credit based on you having age in your business. That's the concept. And we'll talk about the reality here in a few minutes. And that's because the existing company doesn't have the required credit scores. And that's the idea here. When it comes to business credit building, a lot of people believe that you could buy a shelf corporation that's aged, and then that age makes it easier to go get a Home Depot account. And it's a reasonable belief, because if we go to Home Depot or if we go to Office Depot or Staples right now, it'll say right at the top of the page, you need to be in business for 3 years or have $1 million in revenue to apply. Now, little secret is that you don't have to have either one of those. What we found and what I teach is that if you have enough trade lines, items reporting on your business credit report, the time in business and revenue requirements can be surpassed 100% of the time. We see it all the time. We see people that are in business 6 months go get Office Depot and Staples with no personal guarantee all the time. And it happens because they have enough other accounts reporting on their business credit reports to get approved. So I see how this belief comes in. You look at an application page, you see a time and business requirement, you think you're going to get around it by buying an aged business. That's where some of these beliefs come from. Now, Benita says, hey, from DC. What's up, DC? Patrick says hello from YouTube. And Marcus says, what are your thoughts on buying an expired company from the Secretary of State? Businesses that may be expired in the past couple of years have relationships with banks and creditors. We'll talk about that in a minute. What's up? And Stephen, what's up? So, but Marcus, here's a short answer to that. The problem, it's not a bad idea. If you could buy an existing company that already has relationships with credit issuers and lenders, that's not a bad idea. Now, let me say, Marcus, that's not shelf corporations. You're talking about buying a real business, a real entity that had real activity and a real business credit profile score, and now it's just not active anymore. That's completely different than a shelf corporation where nothing was done on the entity. But the one thing that you'll learn of shelf corporations, that's the problem here as well, is that when you buy an entity, you are now liable for what takes place in that entity, which means if that entity was ever sued, if there are outstanding loans, if there are outstanding judgments, if there are outstanding liens, as many times there are, it's why the entity was abandoned, then now you as the new owner become responsible for all that debt. So we'll talk about that later, but something to keep in mind, but hopefully that answers your question. Okay, so shelf corporations can be used to get the opportunity to bid on contracts. Some jurisdictions require a company to be in business for a certain length of time in order to bid on government jobs. Otherwise, a company won't have such an ability. Now, I can tell you that this is the only valid reason I've really seen in today's age to own a shelf corporation, and I think it's kind of valid. Okay, there's some places where you can't even bid on a government contract unless you've been in business 2 or 3 years. So let's say you're starting the business to immediately go in and start bidding on these government contracts, and you see a 3-year requirement to be able to bid. A shelf corporation can absolutely make sense in that circumstance. As a matter of fact, as Marcus said, going in and buying an expiring company from the Secretary of State, one that's already not active, that might make sense. Okay, because again, you need to be in business 3 years to get the government contract. There's no way around that. So to date, This is the only valid reason I've seen why somebody would really want to buy a shelf corporate. They're starting a business for the sole purpose of buying or bidding on government contracts that they can't bid on unless they've been in business a certain period of time. That can make sense in that circumstance. So for instance, and I won't give you an example of that because I think we all understand. Well, actually I will, just so we can talk to it. For instance, a long-established company might qualify for more credit and funding. That's the idea that a lot of people do it. It's not because of bidding on contracts. It's for that purpose that a lot of people do it. So, for example, a lot of people think that a company open for 10 years is going to look more credible than one that's open this year. Okay, but it will seem more creditworthy. This might help to secure more credit and funding. And it's because the majority of businesses fail within the first year and only a small percent take it to 10 years. Okay, this makes sense. It's a valid argument. I'm not saying this is factually true because it's not. As a matter of fact, what happens on commercial credit reports with this will probably surprise you. And I'll give you a hint. You don't get credit for 10 years in business when you take over as the new owner. When you take over as the new owner in the business, the whole thing resets and it's just like a new business. But in theory, this is why people think that it's beneficial to do it. They're going to have a better access to money because they have a 10-year-old business versus 1 year. So what does a shelf corporation do? As we mentioned, nothing. These businesses are completely inactive. They don't have bank accounts typically. They don't have anything, credit lines attached to them. They don't have websites and email addresses. They never had any kind of operations. Okay. Other people buy such companies in Nevada, Wyoming, Montana, Texas, Delaware due to regulatory considerations. So those are some reasons. But shelf corporations typically don't have anything attached to them. There's no bank account. There's no website. There's no anything. They're just there. You're just basically buying an aged entity. So shelf corporations are not looked at favorably by regulators, lenders, or business credit reporting agencies. Many say they're unethical, borderline illegal. Some call them fraud. Not just hearsay. I'm going to give you quotes from a lot of these agencies here in a few minutes. But here's what I found in business, period. I don't care what you're doing. If these three don't like what you're trying to do, don't freaking do it. Like, it's bad news. Anytime regulators, lenders, and the reporting agencies all don't want you to do something, it's really not in your best interest to do it. Because let's be honest, the government, lenders that are worth together trillions of dollars, and business credit reporting agencies, which are worth billions of dollars, these guys have so much money to sniff out what you're doing that you're not going to fool them. Like you're not some dude working out of his home trying to fool him by buying an aged corporation isn't going to be like, you're not going to all of a sudden fool the Bank of America guy. Like Bank of America's like, oh man, you got me. I thought you were open for 10 years and you're open for a year. You ain't going to fool these guys. So whenever you're doing something regulators, lenders, and the reporting agencies don't like, my advice, stay the freak away from it. Like, this is really bad news. If you start doing something that even regulators and lenders don't like, it doesn't end up well because they have so much money that they're putting safeguards in place to look for what you're doing. And we're going to talk about the safeguards in just a minute as well. And Jamal says, hello. And Marcus says, great point. And Jackie says hello as well. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. So what does the FDIC have to say about this? Well, shell and shelf corporations can be created domestically or in a foreign country. They are often formed by individuals and businesses that conduct legitimate transactions. However, they can and have been used as vehicles for common financial schemes such as money laundering, fraudulent loans, and fraudulent purchasing. By virtue of the ease of formation and the absence of ownership disclosure requirements, these companies are an attractive vehicle for those seeking to conduct illicit activity. Guys, look, if you ever go to get a bank account or go to get a credit card from a bank, they have to take your social security number down. It's required by the government. The government requires it to prevent money laundering. Money laundering is a really big deal. Okay, fraud is a really big deal. As a matter of fact, almost all of our loan applications for credit financing get denied because they think it's fraud. So all these lenders and credit issuers and the government, they're pulling trillions of dollars into preventing money laundering and preventing fraud. So when they look at these things as big time vehicles for fraud, illicit activities, and this is all quoted from them. Let's look at some of their words. Illicit activities, okay? Fraudulent purchasing, fraudulent loans, financial crime schemes, money laundering. This is really strong language from the FDIC. And what they're ultimately saying is they're saying, we relate shelf corporations. They are a big red flag for us to look for financial schemes, money laundering, fraudulent loans, fraudulent purchasing, illicit activity. So what they're saying is immediately, the minute they see this, they're immediately starting to think about these things. They immediately start to have these suspicions. And this is a huge problem because even the buying of one of these or even communicating with a company that sells these automatically puts you on the radar for all of these lenders, credit issuers, bureaus, as well as the government because of this exact reason. Okay, so let's see what does the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network say. The majority of these shell corporations sold to foreign investors appear to differ significantly from those used in reverse acquisitions, for example, and that they appear to have been set up solely for the purchase and were not aged or put on the shelf after some period of actual operation. Okay, this type of shell appears to have few legitimate uses and can fairly easily be employed to disguise ownership or movement of assets or to facilitate illicit activity. So we have multiple organizations saying the same thing. These are often used to disguise ownership, to move assets illegally, to facilitate illicit activity. Now, let me say that in 2018, in June, again, the government required banks to verify the owner of the business's social, to verify your identity, to prevent money laundering. That's how big of a deal it is. So when they're coming in and saying specifically that they have no use for this kind of company, it's basically being used to disguise ownership, move assets, or facilitate illegal activities. This is exactly coincides with the government's law in 2018 that all banks must verify identity. So the government, in here as we see the Financial Crimes Enforcement Agency, as well a network, as well as FDIC, is all saying exactly the same thing. These entities are typically used for these purposes. This is why they're problematic. This is why the companies that do this are on our radar. And Jet says, hello, thanks for the great info. Thanks for tuning in. And Twyla from Facebook says, hey, Ty, hey. And Gregory says, I've been trying to get an appointment. It's pretty easy. All you have to do is just give us a ring at 877-600-2487 or go to creditsuite.com/consult. We usually have consults available as soon as the next 24 or 40 hours. So creditsuite.com/consult will get you in our schedule, or just give us a ring. We'll do the consultation by phone. So let's see Entrepreneur Magazine. I've had numerous clients come through my office wondering what they might do with a shelf corporation they paid $5,000 to $15,000 for. They were sold on flashy terms like Dun & Bradstreet numbers, Paydex scores, and unsecured credit, and how they would show how they would somehow win larger loans and use the shelf corporation's name. The truth is there is no shortcut process. Building corporate credit takes time, okay? And that's Mark Collier, How to Scam Proof Your Business from Entrepreneur Magazine. So what's interesting about this is that they hit on all of the points of why these guys sell you these bogus corps. Because they're going to set up the Paydex score. It's going to be easier to get the Duns number. It's going to be easier to get unsecured credit. It's going to be easier to get loans. This is exactly the wording that these companies use when they sell it. And you know what? You guys might know. I kind of know something about Dun & Bradstreet. I know something about Paydex scores. Don't trust me? Like, I don't know. Like, go to YouTube and type in Paydex or type in Dun & Bradstreet and see like whose videos pop up. I know a lot about these guys. And I'm telling you, and I'll show you from Dun & Bradstreet here in a few minutes, what happens when you play this. But again, this is the languaging you have to look out for when they're trying to convince you that all these great things can happen if you come in and you actually buy one of these corporations. So speaking of Dun & Bradstreet, let's see what they have to say. Okay, quote from D&B, thieves can purchase a 40-year-old corporate charter or charter off the shelf, making them look well established at low risk. Creating and purchasing these aged shelf corporations, which adds credit or confidence and often drives automated decision rules, is legal. Using them with the intent for fraudulent purposes is not. Now, I'm not an attorney and this isn't legal advice, but D&B specifically says using these with the intent for fraudulent purposes is not legal. And this is interesting because it brings up a really good question. If you buy a shelf corporation for the purpose of getting credit and loans, then what you are ultimately doing is you are buying a fake corporation, one that never really existed, for the sole purpose of convincing lenders and credit issuers that you've been in business longer than you have. Is that fraud or not? I'm not here to debate that with you. But think about it. If you are obtaining a shelf corporation for the sole purpose of deceiving lenders and credit issuers to convince them you've been in business longer than you have, that's kind of the definition of fraud. Not an attorney, not legal advice. But that's exactly what D&B is saying here. You're buying a shelf corp. You're using it to get money that you're not supposed to qualify for because you're trying to fake your age. Okay, you're deceiving the lender on purpose. That's fraud. And that's one of D&B's concern as well as many other people's concern. Now, D&B also has a history of red flagging shelf corporations, which they absolutely do. Okay, with instructing how to read the reports, D&B also says, okay, users get a unique view of the ownership and management changes of a company since the date it first began operations. Each time a management or ownership change occurs, the report receives a new present control date. Anytime a change of control happens in a business, it's like it becomes a brand new business. If a company started in 1900 but underwent a control change 2 years ago, quite frankly, it's a 2-year-old business. I could stop right now because they just showed you what the problem is. The problem is, the belief is that you can come in and you can buy a shelf corporation. Then you are going to convince lenders and credit issuers you've been open longer than you have. That's the belief. D&B just told you flat out what they're actually doing here. And what they're actually doing is very simple. What they're doing is the minute an ownership change occurs. So if somebody sells you the shelf corporation, they own it. The minute you buy it, they move ownership to you. Now you own it. The minute the ownership change occurs with the Secretary of State, D&B automatically updates the credit profile and does what they're saying. It notifies it, lists it as a change of control and re-ages the business to be a brand new business. That's what happens. So the whole purpose is you're trying to build it, buy a shelf corp to convince lenders or credit issuers you've been open 20 years. But the minute you buy it in 2020, this year, then the D&B re-ages the business to being a brand new business this year anyways. That's exactly what they do. That's exactly their own words. They even give you a pretty extreme example. If a company started in 1900, right, 120 years ago, but it just changed ownership 2 years ago, we look at it as a 2-year business. So this is how they counter this. They're aware of shelf corporations. Anytime the ownership changes in an entity, they re-age the corporation. And this also is something that I told you I would come back to Marcus. Marcus, you said, hey, what if I buy these other businesses here that have expired companies and I can access, their relationships with bank and creditors? You see what happens. The minute that happens, a red flag is put on your credit report. Alerts are sent to any lenders and credit issuers associated with that business because it's change. I have to step away for 1 second. My apology. First time that's happened in a live stream. I had somebody at the door. So D&B is strictly telling you here that what happens is it's pointless to buy a shelf corporation. You buy a shelf corp, they're going to treat it as a brand new business entity anyways. And the age that you're trying to get by buying the shelf corp is null and void because they write it off. As a matter of fact, in case I don't cover this in another slide, I've had instances with clients that get in trouble because they even talked to a shelf corporation. The shelf corporation company put an inquiry on their credit report looking into them, and that put a red flag on their credit report. So D&B, if they even know that you're dealing with entities that are bought and sold by shelf corporations, which isn't hard to do, right? If I own a shelf corporation under my entity, shelfcorporations.com, right? Then what happens is any other entity that's listed with shelfcorporations.com, when D&B sees that the Secretary of State changed ownership from shelfcorporations.com to Bob Smith, then they automatically red flag Bob Smith's credit profile because they see that Bob Smith bought it from shelfcorporations.com. They see that he bought it from an entity that's well known to sell shelf corporations. So even if you never buy the entity, just the fact that you're dealing with companies that sell them can automatically put red flags in your credit report. We've seen it. It's very tough to get that stuff off. So what does Experian have to say? Well, creating companies that impersonate a stable, well-established companies in order to deceive creditors or suppliers is a way that criminals are using shelf companies for fraudulent use. Again, the bureaus, the government, they're all using the same term of fraud. Okay, Better Business Bureau. As tempting as these schemes sound, using a shelf company in order to misrepresent your credit worthiness to a bank could be considered loan fraud. Second time we've seen misrepresentation of your credit by buying a shelf corp listed as fraud. I'm not an attorney, again, not legal advice, but you're seeing the BBB, you're seeing government entities, you're seeing the bureaus, they're all using the exact same language. These are vehicles for fraud. That's the way that we perceive them because we see no other valid use for them. Why else would they exist if you're not trying to deceive somebody that you've been open longer than you have? Let's be honest. Answer that question. Why else would anybody buy a shelf corp if not for the purpose of trying to deceive somebody to believe that they were in business longer than they have? So something to think about there. Okay, James says, my bank told me I had to put my personal name, DBA, on my checks. You don't have to put your well, you do. You have to put your business name on your checks. But so that's it. So what you're saying, James, is I'm a sole proprietor, and my bank said I have to put that name, which is my name, on my checks. Yeah, it's why you need to get away from being a sole proprietor and go with a corporation or LLC. That's just the beginning of problems you're going to have being a sole proprietor, because you are the business. You're also personally liable for everything that happens in the business. So something to consider there as well. And James says, your credit training is proven. It worked for me. Great, James. I thank you, man. I appreciate that. Thanks for following. Stephen from YouTube. So when my DBA becomes an LLC, then my 25-year-old, no, he says, then my 25-year-old business is now new. It's not, because the ownership didn't change. You just changed the entity type. I can change entity type from LLC to corporation, sole proprietor to LLC. I can change entity type all I want with no problems. But if you sold the business to somebody else, then D&B would look at it as a new business. So it's not the entity type change, it's the ownership change that's the problem, okay? And Steven says, good dog, that's awesome. Yeah, Steven heard, that's my German Shepherd going crazy because somebody's at my door. She was in here protecting me to make sure I was safe. So what does Nav have to say? Okay, Nav's Jerry Detweiler issues a buyer beware warning if you're considering the purchase of a shelf corp. She's spoken to consumers who have lost money on such program. Some are outright fraud, and others don't provide the benefits the buyer thought they were getting. Bottom line is, we hear this again: fraud from all of these agencies. So what will the CRAs do? We've talked about this. What they're going to do is they're not looking at these favorably, okay? So the minute that they see a new management change occurred, they re-age the credit report to being a brand new entity, and all the benefit you thought you were getting was poof, gone in seconds, okay? What will lenders do? Well, many lenders look at a new bank account start date as the corporate start date. That's what happens. So let's look at what happens here. So D&B says, well, ownership change, red alert, okay, red flag. This ownership just changed in 2020. The lender goes, oh, ownership change 2020. Okay, go ahead and send us your bank information. We need to see when you open your bank account. So D&B notifies lenders that there's an ownership change, red flag, i.e. issue potential shelf corp. Lenders say, gotcha, D&B. Thanks for looking out. Now we're going to ask you, Mr. Business Owner, for your bank statements. Shelf corporations don't have bank accounts set up when the entity is formed. So you just set up the bank account, and now they're looking at the date you set the bank account up as the date the actual entity began. So this is exactly how the process works for D&B to communicate with lenders what's happening, and lenders to then take evasive action by now looking at the date you open your bank account as the entity formation date, not the date of the original formation of the entity. So shelf corporations have actual credit problems. It makes it harder to get funding, not easier. Again, as I mentioned, when you get an entity, then you take over the entity's problems. So if you bought a shelf corporation, and if it wasn't just a shelf corp, but somebody actually used it for actions, and Marcus had brought this up earlier and said, what if I buy something that's like on Secretary of State that's inactive, but it's been open for 10 years? The problem is you then inherit all those problems. If there's credit issues, if the credit's bad for that business, if there's lawsuits, if there's judgments, if there's liens, you as the new owner are now personally responsible for all of that because you now own the business. So lenders know what to look for. They'll be able to see if a corporation is off the shelf. They'll be able to see if an ownership changed. Okay, and then what's going to happen is then they look at public records to verify it, raises red flags. They look at your bank account start date as well. Okay, so Business Week says our conclusion on whether it was legal was that it is clearly unethical and possibly illegal. I understand that small business owners are strapped for cash and unable to get loans, but they should stay away from these things. If you can't get a loan from a bank, you need to look at other options and maybe even close your doors. It's a bad time, but if you can't secure capital with what your company has in assets, liabilities, and cash flow, you shouldn't try to fool a financial institution. Everybody's saying the same words. You're ultimately trying to fool a bank. And here's why I have to tell you this. It's so freaking, you don't even need to do this. It doesn't make any sense. You don't need to do this. You can go out right now with the startup entity, start using vendors the way that I teach you to do it the right and legal way. Have those vendors report in 30 to 60 days. And in 1 to 2 months, you're getting Amazon, you're getting Staples, Office Depot, Costco, Sam's Club, Lowe's. You're getting credit at almost every major retailer. Our clients are getting Visa card and MasterCard in 6 months. They're getting auto financing in 6 months from just starting a business. So there's no reason to take a shortcut. You gain nothing. all of these guys are going to come down on you, and everything you paid for is lost because they know what you're doing. And then your reports are all red flagged, and you have to deal with that in the lifetime of your business. So this is exactly why you don't want to do it when it's so easy, as even Business Week says, to do it the right way. Okay, another problem is they're costly. They're $500, $600. Some are $10,000 or more. So these are very expensive. Oftentimes they're $5,000 to $10,000. And if you buy a shelf corporation, as I mentioned, anything that's going on with that business, you are now liable for. So something to think about. So shelf corporations, as I mentioned again, aren't really needed for business credit building. If you want to build business credit, get our guide right there, creditsuite.com/live. It tells you exactly how to do it for free, the legal way, the right way, the way that's not going to get you red flagged. You don't need to do this shortcut. This shortcut's going to get you in trouble if not. And let me give you one more thing that we see often happens with buying trade lines and shelf corps. D&B is notorious for shutting down the credit profile in its entirety if they know that you bought the entity from a company that sells shelf corporations. Like I said, it's not hard to figure it out. Okay, even if it's not shelfcorporations.com, even if it's abccorporation.com, and D&B knows that abccorporation.com sells shelf corps. The minute they see an ownership change between ABC Corporation and you, then D&B immediately knows you bought that shelf corp from a company that sells shelf corps. What they do in this case often is they just shut down the credit profile. They don't even go to red flagging. They just terminate it. We have a lot of clients that come in our door with this in a panic and say, oh my gosh, my credit profile is gone. What do you mean it's gone? I went to D&B and it no longer exists. It's like it was never even there. Question's always the same. Did you buy business trade lines or a shelf corporation? Well, yeah, I did, but it was years ago. That's why. No, I don't think you understand. I bought it like 3 years ago. Then I built a lot of legitimate real credit on top of it. Yeah, I get it. But D&B realized finally that the company, the entity you bought it from, was associated with the company that sells these. And so they shut down the credit profile. It's gone. How do I fix it? It's gone. It's done permanently. It's over. It's gone. You start a new business. And you can imagine how disheartening that is for people that have spent years building real business credit on top of a fake initial corporation they bought. Now just to know, poof, it's gone and they have to start over. Guys, I see it all the time. It's why I teach you this, because it breaks my heart to see people come in and spend $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 to buy a shelf corp. Now they're 2-3 years into building legitimate business credit, and the company is gone like that. They try to get loans and they're red flagged. And they're like, how do I get this red flag off the report? My credit profile is gone. What do I do? You don't do anything. It's over. They figured out what you did. You got caught, and now you got to start over again. So don't live like with looking over your shoulder, right? It's a bad comparison, but it's like murder. There's no statute of limitations there. You do something like that for the rest of your life, you're looking over your shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It's the same thing here. The minute you buy a shelf corp, the minute you buy business trade lines, you got to be looking over that shoulder for the other shoe to drop, because the minute they associate the company that sold it to you with the shelf corp or the trades, then immediately your credit profile gets tore up. It's either red alerts on there or it's either shut down. It's always one of the two at D&B. I've seen it literally hundreds of times before. So shelf corps, they're expensive. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Using them to try to get an end around business credit building, it doesn't make sense either. The bureaus know what you're doing. D&B, Entrepreneur Magazine, Experian, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, they all say they're problematic at best. D&B red flags them. They shut down the profile, and your business may never recover from that. It's just not worth it. And today we heard from multiple government agencies, including the FDIC. We also heard from Experian. We heard from D&B. We heard from the Better Business Bureau. We heard from Entrepreneur. We heard from Business Week. We heard from some very reputable sources, and all of them use the same language we don't like. Money laundering, fraud, all kinds of terms that, let's be honest, you don't want to be associated with in your business. It's why you need to stay away from these things, okay? So Facebook user says, great info. Thanks as always. Thank you for tuning in. And Alan Young says, does amending the articles reset the company? It doesn't. For instance, I still remain the owner, but take someone else off. That doesn't. It's when an ownership changes. It's when somebody else buys the entity that the problem occurs. Changing somebody from a president to a vice president, or removing a vice president, it's the ownership change that creates the issue. So if you got value from this, grab our free guide, creditsuite.com/live. Give me a like, give me a love. I appreciate that. Share this with somebody else who could benefit. And if you'd like to learn more, go to creditsuite.com, top right of our page. creditsuite.com, top right of our page are our social media links. Tuesday and Thursday at 1, 11 o'clock on Wednesday, all Eastern, we go live with training just like this. We have daily tips on places like Instagram and Twitter, and we have a podcast you can listen to on your go, which is very popular as well. All of our social links are on the top right of our page, creditsuite.com. I'm not raising the roof. I'm saying it's on the top right of our page, creditsuite.com. The arrow on the screen shows you exactly where it is. Okay, so Marcus says, great info today. Thanks, man. Hopefully this helps you, Marcus. Thanks for your engagement, and thanks for your question as well. Thanks, everybody, tuning in. Hats off for the week. I'll see you next Tuesday as we dive into more topics that help you build business credit financing. Remember, you can listen on your channel of choice to our training, Facebook, Periscope, or YouTube. And it is listed in Facebook and YouTube, our event schedule. At the beginning part of the week, we usually list exactly what we're going to go over that week. So you can go ahead and pre-register and then be notified whenever we're live. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. And Asia says, thanks. Thank you very much. Jackie says, thank you. Credit Suite provides value. Plus, thanks, Jackie. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I hope you all have a great day. Look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks, everybody.